Welcome back. In today's video, we will take a look at medieval Japanese literature. During the Kamakura period, the Japanese warrior caste rose to power while the imperial court lost its influence. This Kamakura period and the following Muromachi period were not without prosperity and peace, but there definitely was a lot of strife, internal conflicts, civil war and more, which eventually culminated in the Sengoku period, a time of countrywide unrest and warfare between clans, warlords and rebellious groups, until Japan was finally united around 1600. Of course, that's a very brief historical summary, but it should be enough to give you a vague idea as to why a certain genre of literature was able to emerge and flourish during these turbulent and warrior-centric times. That of Gunki Monogatari. This term can be roughly translated as tales of war or tales of military accounts, and it's a genre filled with brave warriors and heroic battles. As such, there was no major focus on scaring the reader, or listener for that matter, because Gunki Monogatari existed both in written form and as recitations. So is it even possible to find anything particularly scary or uncanny in them? Well, let us take a look at one of the most important and well-known Gunki Monogatari, the Heike Monogatari, which was written between the 13th and 14th century. The title can be translated as The Tale of the Taira Family. The Hei in the title is actually another reading of the kanji used for the Taira family, in case you were wondering where the name Taira suddenly comes from in the translation. This work deals with two mighty rivaling clans in the 12th century who both wanted to rule Japan, the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan. It's an epic tale interwoven with the Buddhist themes of impermanence and karmic retribution, in which the Taira clan that has become proud and arrogant is eventually beaten by the Minamoto clan. What is important to note is that these Gunki Monogatari were by no means 100% historically accurate war chronicles, and thus they also did feature supernatural elements, as can be seen, for instance, in the story Nue within the Heike Monogatari. In this tale, the warrior and poet Minamoto no Yorimasa is summoned to the imperial palace because a strange apparition is frightening the emperor night after night. For every night at the hour of the ox, which is approximately 2 a.m., a strange black cloud emerges from the woods, approaches the palace and then stops above it, floating there as if it was pursuing some unknown goal. This seems to have happened to a previous emperor as well, who eventually had a brave commander of the guards chase off this strange specter, which is why the current emperor called for Minamoto no Yorimasa, hoping this renowned warrior could do the same. And so, Minamoto no Yorimasa, together with his retainer Ino Hayata, lays in wait for the strange black cloud to appear at night. And indeed, at 2 a.m., a dark cloud approaches the palace. As it comes closer, Yorimasa spots something moving within the black smoke and shoots an arrow at it, which causes a bizarre creature to fall out of the dark cloud. Reacting quickly, his retainer dashes to the spot where the beast landed, presses it to the ground and attacks it 9 times with his sword. In the meantime, others have come running with torches, and they see that it is a terrifying chimera-like beast with the head of a monkey, the body of a tanuki, a snake for a tail, tiger-like feet, and an eerie cry which is described as resembling the cry of a nue. Now, nue is actually a certain kind of bird with a somewhat eerie and lonely-sounding cry. It is also known under the name toratsugumi. Its peculiar cry was commonly seen as a bad omen since around the Heian period, and mention of this bird can even be found in the Kojiki. Eventually, the name nue came to also refer to this chimera-like creature, since the creature was said to let out an unsettling cry similar to that of the bird. And this monster actually appears not only in the Heike Monogatari but in various epic tales of medieval Japan. Interestingly enough, the appearance of this creature differs quite a bit from tale to tale. For example, Stanka Scholz-Chonka in her German article Der leidende Dämon Seamis Nue lists the following depictions. Quote, "In one tale, it has the head of a monkey, the body of a tiger, the tail of a fox, and the legs of a badger. In another, it has the head of a human, a curved beak with wild saw-like teeth growing in various directions, the body of a snake, white wings, and legs with sharp spurs. In yet another, it has the head of a monkey, the body of a badger, the tail of a snake, and the legs of a tiger." Quote end. Despite all these differing depictions, one thing seemed to be common to all versions of this nue. It always let out a whining and uncanny cry that resembled that of the bird of the same name. In any case, frightening and uncanny elements ultimately played no major role in the genre of Gunki Monogatari, and when such elements occurred, then they were usually just a means to create yet another stage for great warrior deeds, such as Minamoto no Yorimasa's skillful use of bow and arrow to shoot the beast in this case. Still, the Nue monster is a fascinating creature, and I wouldn't be surprised if the belief in such a beast caused quite a few people back then to feel a cold shiver run down their spine when they suddenly heard a strange bird cry close by in the middle of the night. In that respect, even a genre like the Gunki Monogatari, which was not at all focused on scaring their audience, might have actually succeeded in bringing a bit of horror and the uncanny into the hearts of its readers or listeners by repeating, spreading, and perpetuating the belief in strange creatures like the Nue or supernatural beings in general. Speaking of the belief in strange creatures, remember how I brought up the terms Oni and Hyakkyaggyo in video 2.1? Allow me to quickly recap. Oni was a common term for threatening creatures, especially those of humanoid shape, and is often translated as demon or ogre. And Hyakkyaggyo contains the kanji for Oni and translates to something along the lines of 100 Oni walking around at night. Now, in ancient Japanese texts from the Heian period, Hyakkyaggyo mostly referred to processions of menacing creatures through Kyoto, but we can also find a Hyakkyaggyo taking place outside Kyoto in a literary work that falls into medieval Japanese literature. The work in question is called the shūi monogatari, and it's a collection of stories from the Setsuwa genre. It's not entirely certain when exactly this shūi monogatari was written and by whom, but it is believed to have been created in the early 13th century as an attempt at reconstructing an even earlier work that was lost, called Uji Dainagon Monogatari. And this shūi monogatari was apparently widely read in medieval Japan among the literate population. Within the shūi monogatari, there is a tale called Shugyosha Hyakkyaggyo Nyaokoto, which pretty much translates to the tale of a Buddhist monk who encountered a Hyakkyaggyo. Allow me to retell the story in English for you. I actually found websites where you can read the shūi monogatari online in classical and modern Japanese, which I used as a basis for my English retelling and which I will also link in the video description. Now, the story goes as follows. A practitioner of Buddhism is on a solitary journey through a province called Setsu. One day, when the sun is already setting, he comes across a large temple, but finds it to be run down and deserted. He feels that this is probably not a good place for someone to stay overnight, but eventually decides to do so anyway, since there are no other alternatives nearby where he could safely spend the night. Once inside the temple, he begins to chant a mantra to Fudo Myo-o, a fierce guardian deity, when, at around midnight, he suddenly notices the sound of many individuals approaching. This in itself is already pretty creepy in my book, because he had previously stated that this was a deserted temple with no other buildings or people in the vicinity. Imagine you finally decide to spend the night in what you yourself had observed to be a rundown, abandoned temple without any signs of life. And now, in the middle of the night of all times, you notice a sound that can only mean one thing, that someone is coming there. Well, he then sees what exactly is causing this ruckus. It's approximately 100 individuals, each holding a torch in their hand, who are beginning to gather within the deserted temple. As they come closer, he notices, as you might have guessed at this point, that they are not actually human, but instead are strange and horrid creatures, some with just one eye, some with horns, and some with heads so terrible that he finds no words to describe them. The man is terrified, but for lack of a better idea, just keeps sitting there chanting his mantra while each of these creatures takes a seat, until one of these terrifying beings realizes that there is one seat less than usual. It waves its torch around and notices the man, now staring directly at him. Then it says,
"Looks like there is a new Fudo sitting where I should sit. You should sit somewhere else tonight."
The man is lucky, as it seems that they mistook him for the deity he was praying to. The creature that spoke then picks him up with one hand, brings him to the outer rim of the temple, and leaves. There, under the temple's eaves, the man cannot help but think to himself what an uncanny and terrifying place this is, and prays for the night to be over soon. Meanwhile, the creatures stay in the temple until dawn breaks. Then they leave, making just as much noise as when they had come. Finally, the man looks up and around and is shocked to see that there is no temple anymore. In fact, even the road he took to get there is nowhere to be seen, nor are there any footprints, even though there should have been, considering about 100 odd creatures had come and gone again. Confused as to where on earth he is, he happens to come across some people who tell him that he is in a remote region of the Hizen province, which is very far away from the Setsu province. Overall, this is a fairly strange tale with some horror elements in it, and it's not the only one within the shūi monogatari either. There is, for example, also a tale called Nagato no Zenji no Musume Sousou no Toki Honjo ni Kaeru Koto, which translates to the tale in which the daughter of the Zenji family in Nagato was supposed to be buried but returned to her home. This tale deals with two sisters and the older sister's husband all living in a manor, when eventually the younger sister succumbs to an illness and dies. At first, her corpse is temporarily laid down in a certain place of the manor that she had quite some attachment to, but then she is finally put into a coffin and brought to the supposed place of her actual burial. However, when they arrive and lift her coffin from the cart, they notice that the coffin is slightly open and empty. They look for the corpse, wondering if, as unlikely as it seems to themselves, they might have lost it somewhere along the way, but they search to no avail. Eventually they return to the house and find the corpse lying where it had been before. It is already quite late, and this strikes them as fairly creepy. But when dawn breaks, they eventually decide to place her into the coffin once more, make absolutely sure that the lid is on, and then wait until evening to see what happens. Then, later that evening, when they check the coffin again, they find it slightly open once more. This terrifies them, but they decide to look around and find the corpse once again in the same particular place of the house. When trying to move it from there again, the body cannot even be detached anymore from the floor it is lying on, and trying to move her is likened to the feeling of merely shaking a big immovable tree that has its roots deep in the earth. Eventually they give up and simply put her to rest right there by destroying the floorboards and burying her in the ground below, creating a fairly big burial mound there. Naturally, the ones that under normal circumstances would have continued to live in this manner find the thought of living together with a corpse far too eerie and move somewhere else. Time passes and the manor eventually rots away. People begin to avoid getting near the burial mound, and word goes around that it is a harmful place. Finally, no one dares to live there anymore, and not even small sheds can be found within the vicinity of this burial mound, which is the only thing that still remains there. Then the story ends with actually describing where exactly this burial mound can be found. As was mentioned in video 2.1, this is not uncommon for the Setsuwa genre and definitely adds a level of realism to this strange story. Despite these two examples, it should be noted that the shūi monogatari is definitely not a simple collection of horror stories. It has its fair share of strange tales, but these are mixed with humorous and even vulgar and obscene ones. Still, the supernatural definitely is a part of many of these allegedly true stories, as you can find plenty of tales about oni, curses, and prophetic or strange dreams in it, and as such it also is a good example of how the belief in the paranormal and otherworldly was far from gone during medieval Japan. Now let's return to the concept of hyakki-yagyo one more time. Some actually believed that just catching sight of such a procession of 100 oni at night would already be extremely dangerous, but despite that, the medieval period saw the rise of what was called hyakki-yagyo emaki. Emaki are picture scrolls, so these were picture scrolls depicting such processions of menacing creatures. A famous hyakki-yagyo emaki, and possibly the oldest one, is from the Muromachi period and is thought to have been created by Tosa Mitsunobu, who supposedly lived from around 1434 to around 1525. The curious thing about Tosa's hyakki-yagyo picture scroll is that among the strange creatures that can be seen on it, there are things like household items, musical instruments, or cooking utensils. So instead of the scary image of demon processions that people usually had when it came to hyakki-yagyo, a scroll like this turned the whole idea of hyakki-yagyo into an almost cheerful and amusing parade of everyday objects. However, with regards to this, a certain Michael Dillon Foster in his book of yokai writes something that I found very interesting. Allow me to quote it directly here. Quote,
"On one hand, this trivializes the whole idea of the hyakki-yagyo as a terrifying otherworldly threat that must not be looked at. At the same time, it also brings the threat right into the home, with the implication that even common household goods possess the potential to become animated monsters."
Quote end. The reason I find this so interesting is because it certainly harkens back to the whole notion of the uncanny as that which is unhomelike, as an unpleasant feeling that arises when something that should make us feel at home is invaded by the unknown. unknown. Because as entertaining as some of Tossa's pictures may be, I think Michael Dillon Foster is absolutely right when he says that this brought the threat right into people's homes. I would not rule out the possibility that some people in medieval Japan, after having enjoyed Tossa's picture scrolls, might have felt a bit differently in their home when looking at some of their everyday objects. Oh, and in case you were wondering, as is quite often the case in Japanese, there actually is a special term for this idea. Household objects, tools, etc. that became inhabited by a spirit are called tsukumogami. Alright, before I end this video, I would like to touch upon one more topic, the No theater. Medieval Japan saw the rise of this new form of theater, which is said to have been created in the 14th century by Kanami and his son Zeami. Granted, some may feel inclined to argue whether theater should even be mentioned here at all when we're talking about literature, and really the answer to that is going to depend on your own definition of literature, but personally I think it counts and I want to allow it for the sake of this series, because although No is by no means a horror-focused theater, medieval No plays do contain numerous fantastical stories featuring gods, demons, and ghosts, thus showing once again how the realm of the unknown played a big role for writers in medieval Japan. There are, for instance, plays that deal with vengeful spirits, or warrior plays where the ghost of a fallen warrior recounts of his last battle and the torment of hell and asks a priest to pray for him. In one such warrior play, the playwright Zeami actually picked up the tale of the Nue again and gave it an interesting twist. In his play Nue, a traveling monk who has finished a shrine visit in Kumano travels towards the village Asiya in the province of Setsu. This village faces the shore of the Seto Inland Sea and is close to the mouth of the river Yodogawa. It acts like an entrance to the western part of Japan for many who travel that way from the capital. Now, when the traveling monk arrives in Asiya, it is already getting dark, but to his surprise, he is told by a villager that he cannot stay there and is instead pointed towards a deserted temple on the shore, where he is permitted to spend the night if he so desires. He is warned, though, by the same villager that a monster is said to appear there every night, but with no other option, the monk makes his way to the uninhabited temple, somewhat disappointed by the villager's unfriendly attitude. Having arrived at the temple, the monk then sits down and looks into the distance, lost in thought, when he suddenly notices a single boat on the water approaching, inside which a strange figure can be seen. The monk, realizing that this boatman is not human, asks him who he is, and it is then revealed that this creature in the boat is the ghost of the Nue that was mentioned in the Heike monogatari, the one that was shot down by Minamoto no Yorimasa. In other words, the twist here is that the typical fallen warrior in this warrior play is not a fallen human warrior as usual, but is actually the ghost of the Nue, which tells the monk how it once plagued the emperor and was then shot down by Minamoto no Yorimasa. It asks the monk to pray for it so that it can find salvation. Then it disappears into the night. Afterwards, the eerie cry of the Nue fills the area. The story continues with the monk eventually deciding to pray for the creature, which appears once more in its terrible original form. It explains how it ended up in this place and utters once more its wish for salvation before sinking into the darkness of the river as the moon disappears behind the mountains. In the end, it remains unclear whether or not the monk's prayers have helped it find salvation. Now, as I said, No is not exactly a horror-focused theater form, but considering some of this play's elements, such as the eerie location of a deserted temple close to the shore where eventually a strange figure appears on the water at night, I figured it was definitely a work that should be mentioned in this video series, especially since it once again picked up the topic of the Nue, and with such an interesting twist no less. In the end, the rise of the warrior caste, the appearance of new Buddhist schools, and the increasingly turbulent times that would eventually lead to countrywide war did cause some of the greater and more prominent works of literature of medieval Japan to focus on military affairs, heroic warriors, and Buddhist ideas, but that doesn't mean that horror and the uncanny cannot be found in medieval Japanese literature, as we have seen in a few examples in this video. After all, the belief in ghosts, oni, and other supernatural entities was certainly as present as ever, and topics like vengeful spirits and demons, as well as uncanny encounters or strange occurrences, do show up in various forms of medieval Japanese literature. It is also noteworthy that the notion of yakiagyo persisted in medieval Japan, and while works like Tosa Mitsunobu's picture scrolls might eventually have given it a more playful touch, they also had the uncanny side effect of bringing the unknown straight into people's homes, times by showing how even everyday objects in our own four walls might actually be vessels for evil spirits. So despite these being fairly warrior-centric times, the uncanny certainly can be found. It was, however, not as prevalent as it would soon be in the time period that we will discuss in our next segment, early modern Japan. And with that, I shall conclude this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, take care and goodbye.